welcome to Balancing the Scales of Justice, which is what we're calling our attempt to break this overarching phrase of criminal justice reform down into digestible bite-sized chunks. So we'll share interviews and stories with the hope of, in some small way, continuing to move this conversation towards creating a fair and just system for all.
Just briefly introduce my guest today, Jim Sawyer, Executive Director of National Association of Pretrial Services, and somebody who I've always enjoyed conversation with. We're going to be starting a couple of chat series, interview series, where we take a look at, some of the topics that are bubbling up to the surface in criminal justice reform, sort of demystifying a little bit of what it means to be when your newspaper says criminal justice reform. So welcome, Jim. Glad to have you. Thank you for being willing to be the guinea pig here.
Happy to join you, Alan.
It's been a very interesting time, right? During this pandemic, this once every 100 years pandemic. I know we've had to adjust. I'm talking to you from my house. I sit here in your house right now. Yeah. Our company has gone all remote, all virtual. And I know a lot of the agencies that you deal with have done so as well. Talk to me a little bit about what they're doing. Are they reaching out to you? Are they trying to figure out some best practices, some standards for how they continue operating?
Yeah, and back in April and May, we conducted a survey of pretrial agencies, and just to kind of, it's not a research survey, there's no. Yeah. It's more of an anecdotal survey, because we were hearing a lot of anecdotal stories about, hey, we're having to shut the office, we're doing remote court, we're doing virtual check-ins, all that stuff, and so we decided, well, let's test that. Let's see what other people are dealing with. So we worked with Arnold Ventures and some colleagues up there, Kristen Bechtel and Diana Spahia, most notably. To conduct a survey, and we didn't want to just throw it out to the pretrial world. We wanted it to be a little bit more pointed, so we reached out to pretrial directors, because we wanted to get kind of their perspective, so those executives in those offices. And we had 197, almost 200 responses, which we were really, really happy with. We received them from 40 different states plus the District of Columbia, so we have input from all over the country. And yeah, we learned a lot. And we learned that at that time, again, this was right at the time when all the shutdown orders were coming, right? So we needed to figure out what they were doing. So we learned where they made increases and where they made decreases, and things that didn't change. So like things that increased: use of video conferencing, court hearings, more pretrial release, more people were being released either on their own recognizance or with some conditions, but higher release rates. We saw jails and courts working together to get people out of custody because of the pandemic, and especially people that were in a pretrial status. As we know, 2/3 of our county jails are filled with people who are in a pretrial status. They haven't been found guilty, but they're still locked up. And we also saw an increase in cite and release. We saw the law enforcement community just citing somebody instead of taking them into custody. They would cite them, release them, and then the process would start from there. We saw jurisdictions decrease custodial arrests. Number of arrests were going down. Bail amounts, money bail amounts were going down. Court hearing frequency obviously was severely decreased. Courts weren't meeting at all during shutdown, except for the most dire need. Supervision fee collection frequency and amounts also decreased, and revocations from pretrial supervision for some or all condition violations. So we weren't seeing supervision being revoked and people putting back into custody for that. And we saw also a decrease in penalizing people for technical violations of their supervision. So all of that, kind of leads us to believe that our agencies were responding well to meet the needs of their system stakeholders, meet the needs of their staff, meet the needs of the community, meet the needs of the defendants that were justice involved. So we saw that. We didn't see any change in diversion. We didn't see any change in case dismissal, really, and we didn't see any change in fines and fee amounts. So none of those changes happened. But the biggest increases, if you will, 90% of these agencies all went to video conferencing of some form.
Yeah.
90%. They had to. So that at least there is an opportunity to learn from that as well. Maybe we don't have to physically have contact with a justice involved person. Maybe we can have that video contact with them and still be effective in supervision, still be effective in check-in, making sure people know that they have a court date and all the things that pretrial services agencies do.
What has happened almost as a byproduct is it sped up an adherence to those standards, to those best practices, if you will, right? In a lot of instances. And for me, I see in working with our pretrial agencies through this period that there's a shift, and I don't know if you're seeing it as well, from painting a broad brush based on charges to really internally thinking through, okay, who do we really need to put in jail in a pretrial setting? And just removing this broad brush and saying, well, you were charged with X, so you're going to jail. I don't know. Are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, you see it, but it's been going on longer than that, than just shutdowns. We've been seeing really for the last probably 5 to 10 years a lot of change in pretrial, asking that very question. Are we really protecting the community? Are we really ensuring that the person's going to come back to court when told to come back to court by locking everybody up? And the answer is no. You don't have to lock everybody up. You don't put money on somebody's head to make them compliant. Most people, even those that are classified as high risk, are nationally have a success rate of around 80%, meaning no new charges, and they make court appearance, which are the two fundamental things that we ask the pretrial population to do. So we've been seeing it for years, and that's what a lot of the reform efforts have been around, is really focusing that very question is on when we need to move away from charge. I think a lot of jurisdictions have largely done that. They've gone more to reliance on risk assessment and making that presentation to the court and letting the court decide. I think as the use of risk assessment has been used more frequently, and we're getting better tools and seeing better results, courts are more inclined to trust the information that they're seeing. and helps them make a better decision. It's just one of the tools that a judge has in their toolbox, but it's an important one. That risk assessment can help inform a lot of the discussion, or what the judge's thinking is as they're making the final decision when setting bail. So yeah, hopefully, again, hopefully we're having that national conversation with people, and hopefully they're having it locally with judges and prosecutors and defenders and court administrators and pretrial and victims advocates and any other system stakeholder that you can think of. Hopefully they're having those conversations. Were we doing it right to begin with, or what have we learned, I guess, is the bigger question. What have we learned in this time where we've had to make some pretty drastic changes on a very short notice? What have we learned that we can carry forward? And I think one of the big lessons learned is that the use of technology is paramount to success for all of the folks involved. We've been doing text messaging for years now with reminders for court, but now when you and I can sit miles away from one another and still talk and have a conversation and look each other in the eyes, we can do that in a pretrial setting as well with the justice involved persons.
The ACLU of Colorado has issued a position that risk assessments, at least the one being done in Colorado, is or should be thrown out because it's racially biased. I know a couple of other organizations have really started. I think Stanford University started to examine the effectiveness of risk assessment, risk management tools. I don't know, maybe give your thought on, do risk assessments have a role to play in the pretrial space? And if so, how can we make them better?
Well, the short answer is yes. They do have purpose. They do have merit. And we address this in our national standards as well. We know that there's a number of well-intentioned groups out there that are concerned about the perpetuation of racial bias, gender bias in the tools. The tools that are most commonly used now are tools that have gone through several generations of change and updating and rigorous study. And to do exactly what some of the folks that don't want risk assessments, they're actually doing that. They're eliminating bias in the tool. They're eliminating inequity in the tools. A lot of the tools are based on a large amount of data. So we've seen tools be successful in Kentucky, for example, for New Jersey. And a lot of the research like around the PSA was built on data from about 50,000 cases and testing predictability there. So we don't agree that the tools themselves are bias or create bias, but there's plenty of room for bias to exist in any system that you can think of. Justice system, education, healthcare, name it. We all own that bias does exist, and it's up to us to do it. The way that you make it better, the way that you do improvement is do exactly, and this is where we agree with folks like the ACLU and others, you have to be transparent. You have to use empirical data. You have to test it to your local population. You need to validate that defendant population to determine its effectiveness. And if it's not effective, if it's doing exactly opposite of what you want it to do or what you think it should be doing, and it is throwing bias into it, then you need to get rid of it and go look at a different system. There are a number of tools out there. We also don't think that an agency who wants to do a risk assessment should just pick one off the shelf or use one that another state's using and say, okay, we're done. We're now evidence-based. No, you have to go validate that against your own population and make sure that tool is working. If that tool's not working, then find another tool that'll do the job for you. But we do absolutely believe that risk assessment instruments are important.
Yeah, and if I could add one editorial comment in here too, you know, my perception is that you cannot think that the tool is the solution, right? That it's a data point. So whatever the risk assessment pops out, you can't just take that as gospel, right? You have to do your due diligence to test it against your population. You have to do your due diligence to test it against, you know, historical data around what, you know, a judge. You really have to dig for those inherent biases instead of just taking the tool as gospel, right? A hammer's only as good as the person swinging it.
That's
and
right.
And I see that too, that I do see there's a place for them. I do see that there's value in risk assessment tools, but it's only as good as the organization willing to make themselves better in using it, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's part of that transparency that we talked about. You know, it's not just one person sitting in a room developing a tool. That one person needs to be working with everybody that's affected. They need to be working with the defendant community that might be impacted. They need to work with the prosecutors, the defense bar. They need to be working with the judges. They need to be working with county administration or, you know, local jurisdiction administration, the elected officials, community leaders. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about transparency. You can't just go hide in a closet and try to develop something. It's not going to work.
You know, you mentioned a higher percentage of cite and release. You mentioned more people being released. You mentioned, you know, lower technical violations. Do you feel like this is sustainable at all, or is this just a byproduct of the environment that we're living in?
We hope it's sustainable. That's you know, what we hope that the study did and what our conference has done is to create sort of this national discussion about, hey, wrapped around this one question, if you can do this during a pandemic, if you can make all these positive reforms in a pandemic, why can't we do them every day? So that's our challenge to the system, is why can't we do this every day? We don't necessarily have to arrest everybody. We don't necessarily have to put them all in jail. We don't have to put money on them. We don't have to have them supervised 24/7 by a pretrial officer. You know, so we hope, because one of the things that, another anecdotal piece that we kind of learned from the survey, because we had issued our national standards for pretrial release in March of this year, so right before we started doing this study, and we looked at all these numbers coming in, and we said, wow, these folks are reforming in a way that the standards ask them to reform without even really knowing it. So that was fascinating to us as we had those conversations. Wow, we're really kind of have more agencies striving to meet our standards, but they don't know that they're really doing that. So it's been kind of a heartening but amusing side note.
I've noticed an interesting phenomenon when it comes to, say, media coverage of this, and that's is what I call the outlier phenomenon, right? You pick an outlier and hold that up as an example of what's going wrong. you tell one person's story of injustice, and in almost every case, it is a true injustice. But using that then to invalidate things and tools, how do you guys as an organization handle some of those, outlier examples when you're building out, best practices and standards?
Yeah, you're always going to have that, but you have to keep telling the positive. You're going to have an outlier, and that's what makes people risk averse, is that one outlier, that one headline in the newspaper makes people risk averse. But for the most part, as I said before, most people in a pretrial setting, most justice involved people in a pretrial setting are successful in doing what the court has asked them to do. Show up to court, don't have any new criminal activity. If you're on a supervision plan, make sure you're talking with your pretrial officer. Do those things. Most of those people are doing well. They're successful. And I say successful deliberately because we used to always say, well, our failure rate is 6%. Yeah. Your success rate is 94%. Yeah. And so part of that is some of the dialogue that system actors also need to change the way that we're talking to people. You're going to have that outlier. It's going to happen. But if you stay with your playbook, even though the ball got intercepted, if you stay with your playbook, you'll be successful again next time. So sorry, we needed one sports metaphor in there.
One of the things that I've seen, or that I think one of the hot topics around pretrial is that of, the use of bail and the use of money in regards to who gets detained pretrial and not, and whether, socioeconomic status or whether savings is a way to maintain fairness. We just saw, last April 2019, New York passed a significant bail reform legislation, and then the following April, scale it back, right? We've seen Prop 25 get on the ballot in California, but then get defeated. So what are your thoughts about the role that, bail and money plays in a pretrial setting?
Well, again, our standards address this, and as I mentioned, they came out in March of this year, and the previous standards was released in 2004. So you can imagine a 16-year gap, how much change has happened in the system, and it really took our team of volunteers to about 3 years to write the new standards and to plug in. And whenever they would write something or they'd find something, what comes along, it's not just like a Bible verse, right? And I say that deliberately because we call it the Bible for pretrial, but it's not just a Bible verse. There's a whole commentary that goes along with it, with that standard, and it's annotated with case law, it's annotated with research, it's annotated with lots of stuff. And in 2004, NAPSA kind of hinted about not using money. And in 2020, we conclusively, undeniably say that there should be no financial restrictions on a defendant, period. That means money bail. That means having to pay for monitoring, having to pay court fees. You are pretrial for a reason. You haven't been found guilty of anything. And you have a fundamental right to liberty. That's in a pretty well-known case, Supreme Court case called Salerno. The fundamental right to liberty. So we think that money unduly penalizes defendants. We think it became a panacea for justice system stakeholders, to make them, feel like they were doing the right thing by, putting a bailout so somebody would come back to. But what it really did was it meant that a lot of people who couldn't afford their bail were having to stay in custody. The longer they stayed in custody, the worse the outcomes for them were. If you were able to stay out of custody pre-trial, studies have shown you usually get, if you're found guilty, you don't have as strict a sentence as if you were in custody the whole time, because of that perception. Well, you were in jail this whole time, you must be a really, really bad person. No, you were in jail all that time because you were poor, or because you couldn't afford, or your family couldn't afford to post money bail for you. So we said, hey, no financial conditions of release, period. And I'm really proud of our organization for doing that. It's a long time coming, as we said, but we just don't think money has a place. It should not be one of the stakeholders in the justice system, and unfortunately, for too long, it has been.
The next logical progression for me is, what's next? What are you guys looking at? What trends are on your radar? What does 2021 look like in your world? What are you sort of keeping your eye on?
We're going to continue to do what we do. We're just going to have to do it differently. We're going to have to do it in kind of like this kind of a platform, right? We're still going to be telling our story. We're still going to be standing behind our pretrial agencies that are trying to make these reforms and make changes for the better in their communities. And we're going to give them all the resources we can, even if it means having them talk to just another member, just putting two people together in a hallway like we used to do at the conference, so that they can learn from one another. We're still going to continue with our partnerships with the National Institute of Corrections and other organizations. We're gonna stand against social injustice. We're gonna stand with people who are trying to make change in social justice for the better. And we're going to continue to support risk assessments and elimination of money bail. And that's those are our flagstone positions, and we're not going to abandon those.
I have to admit, I'm a little bit of a storyteller, and so I would love to afford you the opportunity to share a story of maybe somebody you're locked arms with, or one of your members, where it's an example of something going right. I talked a little earlier about the negative outlier example. I talked about the negative legislation changes, and in one instance, you corrected me to the positive. So I'd love for you to correct me to the positive, and share a story of maybe somebody that's doing something right.
Yeah, I'll just share a little story that we learned from the survey that we did around COVID. Couple of things that, as these pretrial directors are having to turn on a dime and change things, not only did they take the time to answer our survey, which wasn't a long survey, but it did take time to do, and it took some thought for them. And again, we sincerely appreciate it, because we learned a lot from it. But just to hold up some of those pretrial directors at the time when they're shutting down offices, they're having to work with defendants, having to work with staff, having to work with stakeholders to make people safe. They're also having to go out and find PPE for their staff, when PPE was a really tough thing. They were finding PPE for the justice involved communities who couldn't, in some cases, have access to PPE, and they were afraid of infecting their families. So making that happen. In some cases, helping people to connect with support services in the community. Somebody lost their job and needs unemployment. They need help with that. In some cases, that was their own staff, but also just people who needed access to resources like food and clothing and things like that. We saw in our survey a number of those pretrial directors doing that. Probably not in their job description, probably not anything that anybody would ever learn about a pretrial director doing that. But it goes to show you how strong of a community leader they are, not just a pretrial leader, how strong of a leader they are in their communities. And those are the people that in our little slice of the world, those are the people that we like to elevate and say thank you, because they've made a difference.
Well, I have to say thank you. I appreciated you sharing a little bit about what you guys are doing, what you've done, your reactions in a pandemic, your opinions on some of the hot button issues that are affecting pretrial, and just can't thank you enough for sharing a little bit of your time with me today. So thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Alan. It's been a real pleasure.